Good morning and welcome to this webinar. This is the fourth in our series of FAM webinars. If you've been with us before, you'll know the format. We have got an hour, we're going to have two speakers, and then we're going to sort of throw over for questions so that hopefully we can answer some and just get a feel for what you think about this webinar in terms of the subject matter. If you want to go back and look at some of the previous webinars, they're all available on the BOHS YouTube channel. So if you subscribe to that, you can go back and find them and have a look at those the previous three webinars. We'll talk about later of what we want to go forward as well, because we've got some other ideas for webinars coming up in April. So welcome to this webinar today, Asbestos Limits, a discussion. Today we're focusing on RPE. So, really looking at the OEL in Europe and what the implications are for what we know and love and use regularly in terms of RPE. We've got our two speakers today. I want to introduce them. Many of you will know Gary, so he needs no introduction. For those of you who don't know Gary, Gary's an active member of the FAM SC3 Science and Technology Committee, and he has over 40 years experience of measuring asbestos concentrations in air, water, land, and many other matrices. After working in both the UK for the Health and Safety Executive and in the US, he's now retired, but he won't retire, which is good for us. So prompted by the EU's proposal to reduce the OEL substantially, Gary's passion is really looking at the issues surrounding that and how do we reduce the risk of asbestos exposure for the removal companies, for the operatives in the field, and for maintenance workers. And RPE is obviously a very important part of that. So welcome, Gary. So Gary's going to present first, and then we're very a warm welcome for Nick Baxter. Nick is our second speaker today. Some of you will know Nick, but again, I'll introduce him. He is the Respiratory Protective Equipment Technical Lead in the HSC Science Division. Nick has been working in the area since 2006 and leading incident investigations and HSC external research and representing HSC on RPE stakeholder working groups and committees. He was heavily involved in the pandemic and the response, the HSC's response, and also Nick is the chair of the UK Standards Committee for RPE and has contributed to the development of new international performance standards for RPE. Nick is also contributing to the revision of the European RPE standards, specifically EN 149 for filtering face pieces, and Nick is the current Vice President of the International Society of Respiratory Protection. So I think we've got all bases covered today in this webinar. So we're very happy to have both speakers. So I'm going to hand over to Gary, and as we say, we're going to have questions as at the end of Gary's presentation. Over to you, Gary.
Thank you. I just have to fiddle about a little bit to get everything started. Okay, that should be visible to everybody. Thank you for that introduction, Sarah. That's much better than I've ever written about myself. So if you can send me a copy, that would be welcome. So as Sarah said, what we're talking about is RPE and how it interacts with the whole issue of occupation exposure limits and in the UK, the control limit. You all probably know by now that the reduction in the European OEL at the end of this year by a factor of 10 to 0.01 is, quite a sizable issue. And what we're trying to do is get to grips with that in this seminar or webinar series. The important thing is the airborne fibre concentrations that need to be measured so that we are below the OEL will depend on the type and the assigned protection factor of the RPE being worn. And one of the strange things is that this isn't consistent. It changes across different EU states. So there's no uniformity in the way protection factors are applied to the same respirators. To give an example of this, I I'll give you the source for this, but this is from a document 2020. So if we just concentrate on the last two columns, not that I've got anything against Sweden, but you can see that this is all for full face piece APFs. And you can see there's a factor of 10 difference, 40 and 400 for the P3, and then a factor of 25, difference between the power fan assisted, which is what most people use inside the enclosure. So that's, order of magnitude differences for the same RPE equipment. If we look at what is said in the European regulations, and this is the updated one, there's not a lot. Basically, Article 3 has changed from breathing apparatus just to RPE instead. And Article 12 has replaced the point A, that it should be worn, with something slightly more. It should be worn and appropriately handled, with regard, and handled and adjusted through fitting checks. Now, they quote Council Directive 86/656, and when I looked at that, that's a general safety equipment thing. So it covers from hard hats to your safety boots. And I think it's more the fitting checks are more for the hard hat and the safety boots fit than the RPE when I looked at it, but I could be wrong. So that's Europe. Let's go to UK regs. There's quite a lot of them. The first three are specifically in black to do with asbestos, and they're all current. There's guidance, the regulations, and the approved code of practice. The next four in blue are the more general regulation, well, information really, and guidance for other hazards, and as well as asbestos. So there's a lot of guidance covering RPE out there. And if you really want to push the boat out, you could get the European standard at a very cheap cost of 364.14 euros to buy. So you can look at it. I would point out all the other ones are free of charge from the HSE website. Whenever we start talking about RPE and protection factor, and I haven't looked into it, until a few weeks ago, I came across all these sort of words and letters, before RPE and protection factor, and there's a lot of them, often beginning with A: adequate, appropriate, approved, assigned, average. And it does get quite confusing, and different areas like the States or Europe do use them in different ways sometimes. But the first three, as far as I know, adequate, appropriate, and approved, all apply to the RPE itself. Whereas assigned and average, I'll come back to later, nominal, workplace, simulated, all apply to protection factors. And I'll leave that for Nick to sort out and tell you more about. Well, license removal, the UK regulations follow the sort of general rule, don't disturb it if you can, and if you do, keep the dust levels down as much as possible. But if it can't keep it to the lowest possible level, RPE must be provided, yeah, if you're liable to exceed the control limit. And the RPE must reduce the exposure to as low as is reasonably practicable. A wonderful phrase, widely used. And this is from the HSG 247, which is 20 years out of date now and refers back to the core 2002 regs. But it does make the very strong point it can't be your only control measure, and you must reduce air to the airborne fiber concentrations to the minimum. The reason I've chosen HSG 247, as I say, is 20 years old. It outlines how you should really regard respirators. Yeah. It first of all says they should be adequate and suitable, and I'll come back to that. But it defines a whole comprehensive respiratory protection program, or effective, as Nick calls it. And this goes through the whole issue about training, how you maintain it, test it, how you store it and clean it. And I'll leave that for Nick to cover as well. But that's so important. It's not just slap a respirator on or hire a respirator with a face, in this gig economy. How respirators will not protect you unless you have a comprehensive respirator program in operation. A couple of definitions: adequate. This is important, and they are in the early EU definitions in some way. The one I referred back to is that adequate. This is the UK one. It's adequate if you comply with the law. I love that. Lovely circular one, whatever that means. But suitable is important. Why don't we give everybody, air hoses, 2000 protection? It's because they get tangled up, people trip and fall. So you're allowed to adjust the respirator, what you're given to the task at hand. Now, sometimes you may need airlines, but not always. If we dig down into the regulations, which I'm sure you don't want to do, but the bits in red, it is up to the employer to provide the employee with suitable respiratory protection. Now, in this gig economy, you're not just hiring a face with a respirator. It's the employer must provide the employee. Yeah, I think that's getting lost sometimes. And after taking account of the effect of the RPE, that is how you determine whether the concentration is below the control limit or occupational exposure limit in Europe and is as low as reasonably practicable. The other thing I would point out, Reg 11 in the current regulations, it says specifically you must have fit testing. It doesn't say quantitative fit testing, but that's what it should be. And it's carried out and repeated as necessary on a regular basis by the employers. Yeah. So you can see where the responsibility lies. The last bit of HSE guidance, which approved code of practice, no, it is guidance that inside the enclosure during removal, you should have power-assisted full face piece respirators fitted with P3 filters. Yeah, should be worn, must be worn, but or higher performance respirators. So again, it's very clear what is expected. Okay, so how do you look at a respirator and say, is it fulfilling its task, and are you below the occupational exposure limit or control limit? You won't find this equation in any UK guidance. There's a example in HSG 247 without the equation where they talk about how you might do this, and this seems to be a big omission. I got this from a OSHA document 2009, and it's widely used in the States. It's something called the maximum use concentration, which is a simple equation. It's the assigned protection factor times the exposure limit. Now, I think most people who go out on site know that if you get above 4 fibres per ml, there is a problem, because in the UK, the respirators that should be worn inside the removal enclosure have a assigned protection factor of 40. Yeah. So if the control limit is 0.1, that's 4 fibers per ml is a maximum use concentration. In Finland, same respirator with its APF of 1,000, the maximum use concentration is 100 fibers per ml. So you can see the disparity that's caused by the non-uniformity of respirators APFs. Looking at it the other way around, in the UK, if you're controlling the air concentration to 0.1, using the respirators, that the guidance says, full face piece powered V3 respirators, you'll be getting an exposure of 0.0025. In Finland, say, or Sweden, your actual recorded exposure will be 0.0001 for doing exactly the same thing with exactly the same respirator. That doesn't seem sensible. Some data that's recently published, very recently published, this graph, which from HSE, where they went to 8 sites, yeah, and this is just the measurements. They're not the 4-hour control limits, but you can see it's on a log scale, and it shows at these 8 sites that were visited that it's scattered around about 0.1. So if the OEL in Europe, if we were in Europe, fell to 0.01 in December, you could say we'd be in real problems unless we take account of the respiratory protection to meet that control limit. So what they did in this study, they calculated 1/40th of those measurements and the 4-hour control limits, and they found that, hey presto, the people inside the enclosure were getting between 302 and 206 fibers per ml, with the highest individual result of 0.03 fibers per ml. So they were all within less than the 0.1 control limit. Whether it's as low as reasonably practicable, we can always discuss that. But as I said, it's 8 licensed asbestos sites. Yeah, week long they were there. They knew HSE were coming, and this is not just best practice. This is best practice. Yet, when they looked at the use of RPE outside the actual stripping enclosure, when you were dismantling, building it, and waste transfer, RPE was much less consistently used. And in fact, they found that when you were doing those tasks, construction and letting down, the workers got higher exposures than when they were stripping, because once you took account of the lap or the type of RPE they were using. Another important lesson. So a few thoughts. Even the updated EU AWPD seems somewhat behind past and even current UK requirements. Yet UK APFs are much more conservative and even an outlier compared to EU states. So will that cause much greater problems in the UK for both air measurements and to determine as low as reasonably practicable? Think about that. Should the type of respirator in use, here's some proposals, okay? Should the type of respirator in use and its APF be reported along with measured personal air concentrations whenever UCAS labs measure the control limit? Should there be a duty to report air measurements of the control limit and the APF of the respirator worn at licensed asbestos removal sites to a central register which contains the notifications for asbestos removal? And think about it. If we go to all this effort to monitor if the controls are working, why don't we make a similar effort to check that the respirators are working? And this is where I come back to average PF. how well does a respirator, because it's the average performance of the respirator that determines the cumulative exposure and the risk to the workers. So finally, I'm going to put a question for the VVOX poll up. Do you consider that the UK's APFs for RPE, when working with asbestos, a non-threshold carcinogen, are overcautious? So I'm going over to Lee now, who will tell you what to do. And just mention, please put your thoughts in the chat as soon as you can. Thank you very much.
Excellent. So if everyone gets their phone to hand, I will just share my screen very quickly. There you go. You should see VVOX there. So if I present that full screen and I open that, yes. Excellent. So if you join at vvox.app on any browser on your phone, and then the ID there is 115971613, and I can see people are very much ahead there. So perfect. So yeah, if you just jump in and yes or no, nice and simple. Just give you a minute or two there, and then I'll close that. Numbers keep jumping up, so I'll give it another 15-20 seconds, see if there's anybody else joining. Seems to be holding there. So in the interest of time, I will close this off. Apologies to anybody who was trying to get in and wasn't able to. But I'll close that question there. And there you go. So I will. So there's the answer to that. 16.18% yes and 83.82% no. So is there anything? Do you want me to keep this screen up for a moment, Gary, Sarah, or Nick?
I think we've got the message there very loud and clear. Thank you very much. So thank you, Lee. I think in the interest of time, let's move on. And there are there is a question in the chat. It was just a comment. Over 15 years ago, this is from Chris Cooper. Over 15 years ago in the pharmaceutical industry, we had the same issues with differences in APFs. Several studies performed show we were overcautious. So that's an interesting point. Thank you, Chris. Please, again, if you want to continue with questions, please present them in the chat and we can pick them up and discuss them. In the meantime, let's hand over to Nick. So Nick, if you'd like to take over.
Yep, sure.
Thank you.
Share my screen. Okay, so you should be able to see that. So yeah, yep. Good morning, everybody. My name's Nick Baxter. I'm sort of the next part of the session is to talk about RPE, and I'm sort of going to try and give you some understanding of why you could see these, or why we do see these sort of variations in sort of protection factors, or the protection offered to the wearer by the RPE throughout the different sort of countries. So my name's Nick Baxter. I work for the Health and Safety Executive in their Science Division as an RPE sort of specialist. I wear many sort of different hats in the sort of different roles that I do. I sort of attend lots of meetings sort of representing HSE at sort of committee meetings, working groups on RPE. I'm the chair of the BSI PH4 standards committee for RPE. I'm part of the Fit technical committee, so that's all to do with sort of fit testing and the competency of fit testing that's carried out. I'm also the vice president of the International Society for Respiratory Protection. Just as a quick shameless plug, the society that I'm sort of vice chair of, it's all run by volunteers, but it's really, really good. The main sort of ethos of it is to try and encourage the use of RPE to sort of protect the wearers. We sort of encourage participating in standards development to improve RPE. We have a journal where sort of research can be published. We hold regular sort of webinars, very similar to this, so obviously more concentrated on the sort of research of RPE. We have a conference every 2 years, and we run lots of initiatives. The current one at the moment's called Face Up, and that's all to do with sort of improving RPE that's been used in the sort of developing world. So if any more information on that, just look at isrp.com or just direct any questions to myself. In terms of RPE, in terms of my slides, I call it RPD, so that's respiratory protective devices. Exactly the same, it's just the terminology that's used in the sort of standards community. But RPE, there's lots of different types of RPE across the world, ranging from, obviously we all know these simple filtering face pieces, all the way through to self-contained breathing apparatus. And the ones that you're sort of typically familiar with in asbestos removal is full face mask with powered. So yeah, there's lots of different ones in between there as well. All the different types of RPE, they have a different standards that they're approved to. So again, across the world, there's standards in the UK, Europe, America, Australia, Canada, various different sort of places. And all the different types of RPE all have their own each individual standard as well. And within those standards, there's often different requirements. It could be breathing resistance, for example, or inward leakage in terms of the protection to the wearer. But they will often have, for a very similar product, they could have a different pass-fail criteria. So that's sort of the initial sort of steps of where protection to the wearer could be different. Many products are certified to the same standard. So again, sticking to something that you guys are sort of familiar with. So the SAP of RPE, tight fitting, full face mask powered. We're looking at EN 12942. Within that standard, like I say, there's many different products from different manufacturers that can all be certified to that particular standard. And again, there's all different requirements in there in terms of breathing resistance, leakage, the strength of the connections, the material, how noisy the fans are and the equipment is, CO2 of the inhaled air. There's lots of requirements to make sure that they're safe and operate for the wearer. But like I say, you can get a variation. Lots of products within that same standard, but some can be much better than others. So some could just marginally pass all the pass-fail criteria for all the requirements, whereas others could be much better. So within the same standard and the same type of device, you can get a variation there as well. In terms of assigned protection factors, so Gary alluded to that there's lots of sort of different definitions for assigned protection factors. Well, I've sort of come up with my own one here to made it very simple and sort of incorporated lots of things from other definitions, but effectively it's the level of protection that's offered to the wearer when it's worn by the wearer, obviously, in an effective RPD program. So the RPD program covers lots of different things in terms of how the risk assessment is carried out, the selection of it, how it's used, whether it's been trained, the wearers have been trained, they've been fit tested, the cleaning on of it, the maintenance regimes, how it's stored. All these types of things all contribute to the effective use of the RPD in the workplace. And just any one of these things if it was to fail or start to fall in terms of the standards, then that would compromise the protection offered to the wearer. So just by the simple thing of not storing it properly, you can cause damage to it, which can then ultimately lead to it not working properly. So as Gary said, There's variations in APFs across the world for different types of RP. So filtering phase species can range from 4 up to 30, but then across the different types of products, they can vary hugely. Some can range from sort of 5 all the way up to 500. Some are up to 10,000. The key thing to understand about assigned protection factors is that they're all derived from workplace protection factor studies. So that's when people have gone out into the workplace where people have been carrying out their actual jobs wearing the RPE, and we measure the concentration of the exposure that they're working with, and then we also measure the concentration inside their masks that to their RPE. That then generates the protection that's offered to them in that particular environment, and then lots of information is gathered from different places, and then people then assign the protection factors to that type of RPE. In simple terms, just try and sort of demonstrate to you how APF, what it means. So if you've got a person here who's wearing a mask, they're exposed to these particles and dust. If that exposure level outside is 20, their particular exposure limit for this hazard is 5. For this RP that they're wearing, I've said that the APF is 10, so that means that it reduces their protection by a factor of 10. That then controls their exposure. The controlled exposure is 20 divided by 10, which is 2, and that effectively brings their personal exposure to below the exposure limit, which is all good and what we would want. How the APS were derived, so I mentioned that there were from workplace protection factor studies. Many of these were carried out many years ago in the sort of early 90s. They were carried out on lots of different industries, lots of different types of RPD. And different countries sort of chose their assigned protection factors for the different types of RPD are based on their own requirements. And the key thing to understand is that all the workplace studies that were done many years ago, unfortunately, there weren't any consistencies across how those workplace studies were carried out. So whether that was how the sampling methods, whether they sampled from inside the mask, how they did it, the sort of flow rates that they sampled at, whether sort of training was provided to the wearers, to people that did the maintenance, anybody that was involved with the RPD program, that was all variable. Back in the sort of 90s, fit testing wasn't as stringent and carried out as we see it today. So fit testing might have been carried out, it might have not been carried out. And also all the working exercises that people were doing in the different industries all varied as well. All this sort of contributes to the variation that we see in assigned protection factors throughout different countries. What we also need to consider is that the protection offered by the RPE sits in the hierarchy of control. So one of the things to sort of argue about the UK is that we have much lower assigned protection factors, and in my opinion that's in a good way, because we err on the side of caution. So effectively what we're trying to do is trying to make sure all the other controls that we put in place are much more stringent, whether that's things like wet stripping or administrative controls to administer more training, more supervision, those types of things. We're trying to reduce the exposure to the wearer with the other controls before we then implement the RPEs to reduce that to the last little bit to be below the exposure limits. Unfortunately, any PPE, including RPE, ultimately can or will fail to danger. So if we reduce all the exposure as much as possible before the RPE, that's much better if there's any problems that occur with the RPE. So those are the sort of types of variables that we see from APS. There's different RPD, the different types of products, variation across the globe, different standards. There's variation in the workplace protection factor studies that we see that have developed them. RPD programs can vary significantly. There's different way that they're operated, and ultimately some of the assigned protection factors, because there wasn't enough data generated, they were then given by expert judgment. So there's lots of things that can vary and can be confusing. One thing that we do understand with APFs is that generally they increase. So here we've got filtering face pieces. As we go through the different types of RPD, from full face masks, half mask to powered to airline breathing apparatus, the APFs increase, and that we see that from one country to the next as well. Even though we'd have the differences, this is the general trend that we see. What I'm going to sort of introduce now is to put a bit of a spanner in the works and just give you some information about something else that's on the future horizon. And this is an international standard that has been developed. So at the moment, across all the different countries, there's different standards for each type of RPD, each type of product. On an international stage, there's been developed an ISO standard specifically for all types of RPD. So there's going to be one standard that incorporates the whole range of filtering face pieces all the way through to airline to breathing apparatus. Different things for like fire rescue, escape, different parts to it, but essentially there's going to be one standard. There's a whole range of standards for the test methods, and then there's a whole range of standards for the selection, use, and maintenance of those, where to give guidance on how to sort of effectively use those. What the ISO system is going to, or proposes to do within their standards, is a new way of classification of the systems, and that's called a protection class. And that relates to a new set of protection levels based on in-use performance. And effectively, we're going to have 6 protection classes, and they're going to relate to 6 protection levels. So some of the ones are similar to what we see now. So we've got 4, 10, 30, 2000 in the UK. And then we also going to have this higher one as well, which is going to be 10,000. These protection levels, instead of being generated by workplace data, which we see with the assigned protection factors now, these will all be based on laboratory tests, which are based on the total inward leakage testing, which is a test that's carried out to measure the performance of RPD in the laboratory. So in theory, this should be a standardized test. So one test house to the next test house, they will be doing the exact same test on the same, effectively the same instruments, using the same sort of techniques in controlled conditions. There's a range of simulated working activities, sort of like head movements, walking, sort of bending over, those types of things, to try and keep the activities standardized. They'll be carried out in wearers that fit them, and then across a range of sort of facial sizes. The whole idea is to make this whole thing standardized and reproducible from one test to the next, and from one type of RPD to the other type of RPD. One thing to note is that in the ISO protection level system, there's no limit on what protection one type of RPD can have. So effectively, an SCB, an airline breathing apparatus, could have any level of protection, as I say, for a full face mask and a half mask or a filtering face piece. Within the new ISO standards, yeah, they could have any level of protection. This is not these sort of arrows here aren't based on any data that's been generated. This is just something that I sort of predict could happen. You're going to get generally the sort of the filtering face pieces are going to be the lower end of the protection. The SCBA are going to be at the higher level of protection. But potentially what you could have is crossover between, for example, a full face mask could be in the lower end of the protection, whereas a half mask from another manufacturer, another product, could be on the higher level of the protection. So you could have instances where a half mask is giving higher protection than what a full face mask would be. So there's lots of different things that could potentially happen in the future. When is this all going to be implemented is a very, very good question. The standards have been published in 2021. Our country's considering to adopt this. Europe at the moment hasn't any agreement to adopt the new ISO standards. There has been talk about a 6-year transition period, but again, that's not been agreed, or there's no start date for when that will start. So it is at least a couple of years, 2 or 3, 4 years off at least. What we do know is that Australia have implemented the ISO standards. So they're currently going through significant amounts of sort of consultations with people like myself and other sort of areas within their country. And in terms of the UK and myself and others within the RPE community, we're taking a really interested eye on that to see how that will sort of pan out. One thing also to note is that the ISO protection level system based on the laboratory test, there has been no validation of that done yet. So really a significant amount of validation and lab testing needs to be carried out, very similar to what happened with the site protection factors in the sort of 90s and early 2000s. Something similar needs to be done going forward for this sort of new system as well. And yeah, any questions on that? Yeah, I'm happy to sort of take questions as a part of this seminar, but you can also contact me via my email address there for anything outside of this.
Thank you,
very
Nick.
much.
Thank you. That was a really interesting
sharing.
presentation. Thank you. And I think this new ISO protocol, if it comes in, could actually be really useful, but it's a long way off. So what do we do in the meantime? Yeah. So there are some questions that have been posed. One from Ian McDonald about the Robin Howie report, which is probably about 30 plus years old now, which was a game changer at the time in the asbestos industry. He's posing a question because we had an APF then of 40 times protection factor for full face powered respirators. Is it time to revisit that report?
It could be. It could well be.
It out there.
It could well be. Yeah. Like I said, it is a long time ago since all that happened. Mm-hmm. I mean, yeah, RPE products have improved in terms of certainly their sort of durability, their sort of mechanical strength, their materials, things like that. But in one sense, the protection that's provided to them in terms of the standard requirements hasn't really changed much. So that they're still tested to the same standards as what they were in that time. But certainly that is a very good question.
And I guess as well, back then Robin was looking at sort of dry stripping and the effects on health of that. So obviously things have moved on. Sure. Although we're still seeing now with the HSE's latest published review of asbestos removal tasks that there's still not enough controls in some scenarios, particularly with AIB, which is really difficult to manage removal wise. So maybe there is some questions there. Gary, do you want to come in at this point?
Yeah, just from memory, and I think the 3M report referred to it as a as-found study. So it's what was found, just going to a site, whether they had a full RPE program or even, I don't think they even had face fits. I could be wrong, but I don't think they did. So it's referred to as found study rather than, what Nick's been describing. So hopefully we've improved, and HSE did revisit that study shortly afterwards, and I think their lower 95% were better than an APF of 100 or 200 when they looked at it. And there was a Swedish paper as well, or a Scandinavian paper. So there were a couple of studies shortly after that. So but since then I haven't been following it.
Okay, thank you. So just moving on, gathering a few more questions in the chat box. Nick, I wonder if you could help with this one. This is from Nick Garland. Are countries that have got very high APF for masks, are they confident in their stats, or do they believe they're maybe a little bit overzealous? Have you got any indication of why they would head that way rather than where we are, maybe, although we're overcautious?
Yeah, and I might have to duck out of this a little bit. I just don't know, unfortunately. We are wanting to. I'm personally wanting to look at the sort of variation APFs across the different countries. That's something that I want to look into as part of my role within HSE But yeah, I just don't know why the different countries have chosen them, and there is a significant difference, as sort of Gary looked at, is from 40 up to sort of 500. That's a significant difference in protection that they're heavily relying on in terms of their RPE.
Yeah.
Given that some of the countries in Europe don't have fit testing, which is, in my opinion, very important in terms of the fit to the wearer. So yeah, I'm not quite sure.
Is the fit accreditation, is that across Europe as well, or is that just a UK?
It was originated in the UK, so yeah, the Fit to Fit scheme is used throughout UK. The Fit to Fit are sort of endorsing various different similar schemes across Europe. So yeah, it is sort of spreading over there again. So yeah, fit testing in Europe is becoming much better.
Right. Thank you. Colette Willoughby is posing a question here. Is there a correlation between APFs within other countries and their annual asbestos-related death rates? That's a big one. Thanks, Colette. Nick, I guess you're not going to be able to answer that. I don't know whether Gary, you want to come in, or both.
Yeah, I've not looked at the statistics about asbestos-related injuries and deaths. Unfortunately, I wouldn't be able to comment on that.
Sure.
Good point. You need epidemiologists to look into that one.
That's one for the FAM conference with Andre, I think, and maybe Lucy. But it is a really important point, because
sure.
that's the crux of it. So thank you, Colette. We'll take that one forward. There's another question here from Peter John Jacobs. Disposable versus elastomeric respirators, not a term I've come across. Which option would you recommend?
It would be based on their risk assessment. In terms of filtering face pieces, they are disposable. They're simple to use, very easy to sort of cheap to purchase. The elastomeric is basically just a name for a half mask. They're reusable. You get very similar protection from them, but there's obviously things you need to, in terms of maintenance, cleaning, that type of thing. So it all depends on the sort of selection process of the employer, making sure that it's adequate and suitable. It will come down to their risk assessment.
So, and can you elaborate? I've not come along, and it might be my complete ignorance. What elastomeric? What are they? Are they just sort of plastic masks rather than paper?
Yeah, they're just the silicone sort of half mask. Yeah.
Fine.
The elastomeric sort of comes from the American sort of terminology.
That would explain it. Andy Chalk is posing this question. Is this why the EU are bringing the OEL down to 0.01, because their APF is much higher? I guess depends on which country we're talking about, but I think from what we've discussed and what the two presentations are, there's so much variability, so I don't think we can really answer that one. I don't think that's why they're bringing down the OEL. That's a completely different subject, and you might want to refer back to the first webinar that we did introducing why the EU have modified their Asbestos Workers Directive for some of those answers. So maybe go back and have a look. We've also got welding fumes question here. What kind of RPE is recommended and APF? I think that's a different subject area, and maybe you might want to contact Nick separately outside of this webinar, if that's okay, Bennett. And then Sam Lord, of course, is very much working in this area, and she's put a link in the chat box, so please have a look at that. So I've just Nick, thank you very much for your presentation. I think it was just a really interesting subject area that we're going to have to keep watching, I think, to see how things change. But it's going to be a long time coming if we're going to have a standardization, but I think it's needed, definitely. I'm just going to go and share my screen again. Maybe not that, though. Let's go back here. And we've got another question on VVOX for you. So if Lee, if you'd like to take over and pose that question. Thank you.
So if you stop sharing there, I'll share my screen again. There we go. So if everybody's still got their phones handy, I'm sure that you won't have been kicked out. So if I go to the next question there. So it says, yeah, 34 of you are still there. There you go. Some people are answering. Again, we'll just give this a couple of minutes, let everybody get an answer in.
Thank you. Just while we're waiting for that, there's a question here that's come in from Brett Millward, talking about beards and RPE, which is a bit of a problem with the current trend for facial hair. Have you got any comments, Nick, on how we can look at RPE that could provide the protection we're looking for? But in the asbestos industry, it's taken as read that everyone is clean shaven, but you do have challenges every now and again, which does present an issue for business as well as for managers trying to manage that transition from with facial hair.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of RPE and having a beard, it's obviously the employer's responsibility to provide the right level of protection for the wearer, to reduce the exposure to below the exposure limits. And obviously they need to sort of carry out a risk assessment to select the right type of RPE. There's a whole range of different things that you can select. If it's tight fitting, then according to the manufacturer, HC's guidance and the standards, it should be the wearer should be clean shaven. If the wearer doesn't want to be clean shaven, then there are other options available, sort of loose fitting devices. But obviously, in terms of like asbestos stripping, there's sort of problems there in terms of the decontamination of the sort of softer materials. So often, obviously, it needs to be tight fitting for asbestos removal. But in other applications, you can have loose fitting ones in other industries. In terms of, just to give a bit more information on that, the HTC did some research looking at the effect of stubble on filtering face pieces. So it wasn't full face mask; it was a simple filtering face pieces. And we found that there was a huge variation from one person to the next person for the different type of RPE and also how long it was. But we found a general trend that as the wearer's stubble grew, the protection offered to the wearer reduced. So it is vitally important that the wearer is clean shaven, and particularly when you're working with things like asbestos, even more so.
Thank you, Nick. That's pretty much what I thought. It is a difficult one. There are so many different varieties of face pieces now, loose, some tight fitting, but they just don't fit in our arena because of the decontamination. And obviously, we don't want to take anything away from the site or take anything home. So, it's an interesting one. Do we want to finish the poll, or Gary, do you want to come in first?
Well, you can. Yeah, I just want to make the point. I only stuck with tight fitting APFs because it's a very complex subject. But if it's loose fitting or a hood or a blouse, it's much lower. So what I presented and was by far the best performance. If you've got facial hair, even if you go for another type of protection because of that, it's much lower.
Yeah. So tight fitting is something we know and love and use very regularly. So I can't see that changing, but there may be different models out there in the future. But it's just taken as read that asbestos removal contractors understand the score. They come to work clean shaven. Lee,
Can I also add? before
Yeah.
we close, I mean, now the poll's voted on.
Yeah.
The reason that question is there is that HSE over 25 years has done 2 studies inside enclosures to get that data, once in 1996 to 98 and once in 2019 to 22 or something. We need to do better than that. We need to know what's happening in enclosures, but I've said that after the poll. So we'll see what other people think.
I'll
Okay,
close
Leo,
that now then, yeah. So thank you for everyone who did that. So there's your answer there, 68.85 yes and 31.15 no.
And of course, that's very dependent on the quality of the fibre counting, the actual test that's performed. So if we get that right, it makes sense to be able to report both in a public domain. Something to think about. So thank you for responding to that, VVox. If you'd like to close that then, Lee.
Yep.
Thank you. There are a few more questions in here. They're rolling in. Kat's put here about the differences between qualitative testing for half masks, reusable half masks, which is standard practice, taste test in the UK. But she's asking here, should we move over to quantitative testing for all types of RPE fit testing? You're going to say yes, Nick, aren't you? I can feel it. What's your opinion? What do you think?
Well, all methods are in HSE's guidance, so that they're all perfectly acceptable fit testing methods. What HSE would accept.
Mm-hmm.
So in that aspect, we would accept all of them. There are pros and cons for both of them. Obviously, the qualitative one, it's much easier to administer, it's cheaper to buy, it's much more quicker and effective. Was the quantitative one is much more on one end, a bit more accurate. You get some results, you get connected to a machine, that type of thing. But they are different, but both equally accepted within HSE. That's the answer I can give, I'm afraid.
That's what I expected you to say. So Kat, I think we'll stick with what we've got for the time being, as long as everyone's been trained in how to use it, of course.
Certainly, yeah. The key thing there, the competency of the fit test carried out. So you're looking for the fit to fit accreditation.
Yeah, sure. We've got thank you to everyone that sort of put extra materials and links to the Stubble report, the HSE report that came out a few years ago. So thank you for that. I'm just going to share my screen. Looking at the time, we're nearly run out, and I just want to say thank you to both our speakers today, Gary and Nick. Really interesting discussion. There's a lot more to talk about on that. Gary, do you want to come in? I've just seen you put your hand up. If you unmute, that's it. Yeah,
well, I'll just say, I mean, hopefully the next webinar will be research priorities. It's there's an HSE forum in March, which one or two people from FAM will be going along to, and it would be good to report back. We're trying to look at best ways to consult and report, but we thought at least we can report back shortly after, before the conference anyway. But it's just that's what we're looking at. But after that, we have an exciting program already in development for more webinars and to continue this series. So keep watching this space.
Lovely. Thanks, Gary. And just finally, before we close, again, you can find all the other webinars that we've had in this series on the BOHS YouTube channel. So I recommend that you subscribe to that. And this one will be put onto there as well later today. And also, I just want to put a plug in for the FAM conference, which means, we will all be together in one room, all those that decide to come along. Lots of discussion, lots to talk about. So please get your super early bird tickets, really, really good value. It's in Birmingham. It's right by Birmingham New Street Station, so you don't have to worry about parking. Just get on a train, come to the conference and be part of the debate. There is so much to talk about at the moment. And as Gary said, if you get the FAM email newsletter that came out recently, it mentioned about the HSE research session that they're having, looking at what the research policy sort of direction research should go into. So if you want to feed into that and you want Gary and other members of the team that have been invited to that meeting, please get in touch through BOHS, marketing@BOHS, and we will have a look at that question and put them forward. So lots of opportunity to get involved. So thank you very much for your time today. We've just gone past 12 o'clock. Thank you again to Gary and to Nick for their time today. And thank you all for being here. And we look forward to seeing you either at FAM or at the next webinar. Lovely. Thank you very much. Goodbye, everyone.